Dear Father in heaven, Lord, that's my prayer for all of us, that as we continue to go forward and troublous times continue and increase, that all will be well with our soul, that we would experience peace like a river, Father, having our eyes set on a heavenly prize, giving us, Father, the strength and the patience to endure till the end. I pray for each one of us to be blessed with the love for souls upon our hearts, that every prejudice, every discrimination, every bit of hatred or ugliness that may still remain in us, Lord, that we would see it and expel it, that we would bring glory and honor to thy name as we continue to go forward. And then with that love, Father, would be healing power for sin-sick souls. We thank you, Father, for the blessing and the privilege to be a part of this, Father. We thank you for opening these truths to us. We thank you, Father, for the work that it has done in our lives thus far. And we thank you that he that began this great work in us will complete it unto Christ Jesus, who is the author and finisher of our faith. We pray as we continue to study, Father, digging into the Midnight Cry message, that you would continue, Father, to bless us with greater understanding, so that we would be fully prepared, Lord, to take a clear message to the Levites, that we would have a love for all those you bring us in contact with. We would have a love for all souls, Lord, that we would be able to give the message with clarity, that will have power, that will work upon their hearts and draw them away from the world and unto yourself. So bless us as we continue to study. May your Spirit ever be with us and guiding us and strengthening us. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see how well the dog does, and he might get the boot. He does really well when I just set him outside and close the door. Oh, don't know who that was. Okay, we're on number 14, and there's one more in this series. And this one here is Daniel 11:40, part B. What I thought was interesting, and there is a quiz at the end, I did have the time to put that together. What I thought was really interesting is all the things, and maybe you guys can't relate to this like I do, but all the things that were here in this message throughout this entire time. And I find myself realizing how dull of hearing and understanding I am, and how whatever I need to do to take away the dullness of ears and the dullness of understanding, that's my prayer. Because things have been being taught all along that I know I didn't get. We get them now, but they were there from the very beginning. And it goes to a testimony as well that that when the first angel arrives, the message is all there, as she words it, encapsulated, right? And it's just an unfolding of more understanding as you go forward. So the message is all there. We know that we've learned that from each dispensation, that the message is always there at the beginning. But it takes swelling to the loud cry to understand it, but it's always there. So in our last study, we began to look at Daniel 11:40, and our purpose was to compare and contrast part A and part B. And when we looked at part A and B, we could form a pattern. And this pattern said that there would be a deadly wound, a death, and a resurrection. We saw this most clearly with the king of the north, which then enabled us to see it with the king of the south. That if the king of the north received a deadly wound, died, and resurrected, then the king of the south must also have received a deadly wound, a death, and then resurrect. And we could see that the deadly wound could happen in 1798. In 1799 was the death. This is for the King of the North, and then for the King of the South, the deadly wound, 1989, and then the death, 1991. It was the end of the Soviet Union, the end of Gorbachev, and Gorbachev resigned, and the death. So you had the deadly wound that brings about a death, but then it would be healed. It would be a resurrection. When we consider the deadly wound and death of the King of the South, we went back to the lines of Pyrrhus in Italy, the Omega history. And when was the deadly wound in the Omega history? In the line of Pyrrhus in Italy, we see the battles of Heraclea, Asculum, and Beneventum, and then the Sunday Law. So you have Heraclea, Asculum, Beneventum, and the Sunday Law. And that deadly wound for Pyrrhus was at the Battle of Beneventum. So we would place the wound, the deadly wound at Beneventum. This is where Pyrrhus is defeated at Beneventum. In Daniel 11:40, the King of the South is defeated in 1989. A defeat and then a defeat. So you have the defeat here and you have a defeat here. So 1989 becomes Panium, which is the Battle of Beneventum. If the Battle of Panium is the deadly wound, then when is the death? And that's Sunday Law. So this was something interesting that it took me going through these notes to try to understand what she was saying. But she blays out, and we'll see it, because we connect 1989 to Raphia. But this is connecting, which we already knew this, we've studied this before, but 1989 is connected with Panium. It was just putting the two side by side that I wasn't connecting, because we look at 1989 and connect it to Raphia, but this connects 1989 to Panium. And they're two different stories. We saw this exact same dynamic. 1989, the Soviet Union begins to fall in a fashion that is irretrievable. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the elections in Europe, its defeat was inevitable. This is why it's deadly. At the Battle of Beneventum, or Panium, Rome's defeat of the South was inevitable. So if you go back to that history of Pyrrhus, Rome's defeat of the South was inevitable, but it had not yet been completed. And that was at the Battle of Beneventum. So what was the problem after Beneventum? Was Pyrrhus still alive? So at Beneventum, Pyrrhus had not died. Had Tarentum fallen? No. So at Beneventum, Rome defeats Pyrrhus, and this is 275 BC. So Pyrrhus is defeated, and it takes 3 years to 272 BC from the defeat of Pyrrhus to where he actually dies. It took also these 3 years for that chief city, Tarentum of the South, to be conquered. They held out under siege for this period. So you see that Beneventum is where Pyrrhus receives his deadly wound, but not dead. And then the death where Pyrrhus dies and Tarentum falls, it comes 3 years later, 272. So in the lines of Pyrrhus, towards the end of our reform line, we see the same pattern. 1989 to 91 is the deadly wound and the death of the King of the South, which means when we come to our history, it can't all be done at Panium. It's not a hard point or a hard date. It's not just, it doesn't just end there. It takes time, so it's progressive. We can see whatever occurs at Panium makes the fall of Russia as a global superpower inevitable. But it just begins that process and is completed at the Sunday Law. And on the streets of Argos, which meant harvest, Pyrrhus dies the same year Tarentum fell. So you have Argos, which meant harvest, was where Pyrrhus dies, and Tarentum falls. So you have the death. So this pattern of deadly wound and death become another story, Panium and the Sunday Law. It is a repeating pattern. So in this context, when we consider 1989, what story does it tell us? Because we understand 1989, the beginning of the line of the priests. So here we have 1989, you have the line of the priests here. It's 30 years of process of training. It takes you to 2019, which was Raphia. So we have the 30 years of the priests. We're not going to go into that study. We just want to see that symbols have more than one meaning. 1989 is the story of Raphia, not because of the king of the north and the king of the south, but it's the story of the priests. That's our theme, that symbols can have more than one meaning. And if we take 1989, the time of the end, and we want to understand the king of the north and the king of the south and their relationship in this time period, it's also the story of Panium. So 1989 is the story of Raphia, and 1989 is also the story of Panium in the history of the king of the south. 1989 is a deadly wound, and Panium is a deadly wound. They tell us the same story. These 30 years are the story of the priests, and then the story of the history of the fall of the king of the south. And when we consider 1989, we began to consider what that looked like. Was the US there in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall? Who took down the king of the south from the inside? So when we consider these concepts about what this war looks like, some people are inclined to say Raphia is not a hot war, but a hot war is coming. But 1989 is not the Battle of Raphia. It's the Battle of Panium, when we're in relation to the king of the south. And it's telling us a story of the king of the south falling 1989 to 1991, then falling Panium to Sunday Law. So you have the deadly wound and the death, and you have a deadly wound and you have a death. And that's the history of the king of the south. But with the history of the priests, you have the 1989 bringing us to Raphia, telling the story of Raphia, which is the 30 years of training for the priests. So two different themes in the same line. Sorry, guys.
So is it history repeating, Sister Elaine? Is that like the connection of it?
The history repeats?
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, going back to that slide of just connecting, what am I trying to say? Connecting 1989 to Beneventum, and then also connecting 1989 to Raphia.
Correct. So it's two different stories on the same line. One is telling the story of the priests and Raphia. 1989 is leading you to Raphia, the story of the priests. And 1989 also in the history of the king of the south is telling you the story of Panium. Because we knew from comparing and contrasting Daniel 11:40, part A and part B, that there was a death or a deadly wound, right? Mm-hmm. With the papacy in 1798, there's a deadly wound, and then the Pope dies. It tells us the story of a deadly wound, a death. We know that the deadly wound is healed. So there's a deadly wound, a death, and a healing, which means resurrection. So comparing and contrasting part B, then the king of the south would also experience a deadly wound, a death. And we knew that, but we didn't know that it would be healed. So comparing and contrasting taught us that the king of the south would also resurrect.
Yeah.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just, I guess, the confusion that's like kind of like balancing all of this in my mind is like, you know, that's what's kind of like it, because I'm just never mind. I'll probably talk to you later or something.
No, it's because I understand it. It's like we're watching a movie that has multiple stories happening on top of one another. And when you come to the end of the movie, all the stories merge.
Yeah.
And come together, right? But each piece has to be understood separate and distinctly to move on to the next piece, to the next piece, to the next piece, for all those pieces to then come together. (1989 and 91 is the story of Panium to the Sunday Law. And all of this from 1989 to the Sunday Law is what verse? Daniel 11:40, part B. 1989 to the Sunday Law is 11:40b, and it covers this entire history. Because 1989 to 91 what we see at the beginning, we see also at Panium to the Sunday law, the end. Because there was a resurrection, there was a deadly wound, a death, and a resurrection. We would see this history repeated in this history. So we would see this history repeated in this history, because that death is there's a resurrection. So then at Sunday law, what verse do we have? Daniel 11:41. So just in this verse, we can expand it out, as we've been doing in this movement since 1989, and seeing it more and more clearly. We have a deadly wound and a death, and this history is telling us a story of a deadly wound and a death. So when we try and consider what 1989 looks like, it's the end of this unconventional war, Cold War. You had the unconventional war, and so 1989 is the end of that. Panium is the end of an unconventional war. So you have the Cold War here. It was an unconventional war. This is the end of it. You have an unconventional war, and this is the end of it. The King of the South in 1989 was destroyed from the inside. The King of the South will be destroyed from the inside at Panium. So these are pieces that, you know, like what you're struggling, we've all struggled with. We still struggle in various places that to grasp the concept, but this is back again, back in April of 2019. And I don't know, I know myself, I couldn't have I didn't hold on to the thought. Maybe I heard it, but didn't hold on to the thought and the realization that the King of the South would be destroyed from the inside. I don't know if anybody else can relate to what I'm saying, but all of this has been out there from the very beginning, but I know myself have been slow and dull of understanding and hearing. So the King of the South will be destroyed from the inside at Panium. So when we discussed our mode of warfare, we went back to 1989 and we traced its development. And remember, the mode of warfare is a whole nother line. When you go into information war, it's a whole nother line. So we trace it back to its development. It's giving us evidence of what war looks like, not just for Raffia, but for this entire period, not just here, but for the entire period. We're going to see it as a defeat of the King of the South. The primary thread is Panium. It's the end of the war that looks different to what people expect. In the history of 1945 to 1989, both parties were restrained. There's a division of spheres of influence, and they're using information tactics, subterfuge to undermine each other. So that's what was going on here. You remember the nuclear weapons were a, what's the word? Maybe somebody knows the word I'm trying to think of. A deterrent. Huh?
Or never mind. I thought you were thinking of the term MAD, but no, they weren't using those, right? Because of mutually assured destruction, right?
Right. So they were a deterrent, and so they found other ways to fight. And those ways were through, there's a division of spheres of influence, and they're using information tactics, subterfuge, and to undermine each other. Coming to our history, and we'll recall the quote from a Russian general, "There's no distinct line between war and peace." So the USA and Russia can be at war without war ever being declared, without it being obvious to see. That's essentially what he's saying. And sometimes if you listen to what these people are saying, both Putin and his generals and even Donald Trump, it just connects with prophecy. 1989 to 91, what did Donald Trump say this history was? So Donald Trump commented, if anybody remembers, we read some of that. And where was it written? In, I want to say it was in that executive order. I think it was the executive order where he named the threats and we needed to have greater security. That was 2017, but I can't remember the name of the executive order. Maybe somebody does. But that's where I'm pretty sure that's where he made this statement that 1989, the internet was invented. And Trump says the rise of the internet corresponds with the rise of the USA as the world's only superpower. 1989 to 91 gave us the clues where this battle is fought, whether it's hacking, cyber attacks, like we saw happen last year, or whether it's manipulating public opinion, as happened in 2016. This gives us the clue where this battle is fought and the tools that are used. And it corresponds with the rise of the USA as the world's only superpower. So if we make this 1989 Panium and 1991 Sunday Law, what's happening? So you have 1989 to 91, you have the internet rising, you have the rise of the only superpower. If you make this Panium and this one Sunday Law, you have the same thing happening again. That the United States is going to rise as the only superpower. So the rise of the USA is the only superpower because who's falling in 1989 to 91? The Soviet Union, or the King of the South. He's defeated in 1989, a deadly wound, and killed in 91. So he'll be defeated and receive a deadly wound at Panium and killed at Sunday Law. And I think it's really interesting that this is another, but it's towards the end of the study, to realize who actually defeats the King of the South. Whose job was it to defeat the King of the South?
Wasn't it the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't that part of their job function?
That was their job function.
Yeah, was to destroy. Yeah, I think that's so interesting how there's like war after war after war. So you see like Russia's defeated, then you see the US go into power, then you see the papacy come up to take over, again, and then you have God's church who ultimately just destroys everything. That's just like really interesting how all these wars are just being fought out. Interesting.
So if it was their job function, and we're going to see as we go through the study, they failed their job function. We see that they follow the pattern of Israel as well, failing their job function. And this is a line of success for God's people. So what is it a line of for Babylon, for the papacy? It's a line of success. So if their job function was to defeat the King of the South, then what does the Catholic Church do? I don't know how that looks. I don't know if anybody's thought about that, but maybe as we go through the study, if anybody has thoughts on that, bring it up when we get there. So Panium is the defeat of Russia, the beginning of its fall until Sunday Law. So whether it's this 1989 to 91 or Panium to Sunday Law, these histories overlap. And we have the rise of the United States as the world's only superpower. So you have the King of the South falling, you have the rise of the internet, the US rising as the only superpower. So which is, let's see, the US is prepared to start acting like a different power. And if you have the transition of you have the transition of the 6th to the 7th head here. So it's getting ready to, let's see, you have a change, the Sunday Law, the USA is prepared to start acting like a different power. I thought another point came to my mind in reading a little bit of early writings this morning, that you have the beast and his image. I don't remember the passage I was reading. It was in the third angel, but I think that was, or it might have been somewhere else. But I was just really thinking about all these distinctions that, in my lack of being a careful reader, there's the beast and his image. That's two separate entities. Is that correct? So you have the papacy and you have the United States, because the beast is the papacy and his image is the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that is correct. There are two separate and distinct entities, yes.
So when we discuss what 1989 looks like, and as the Soviet Union gradually began to lose control of those spheres of influence, 1989, they begin to hold elections. In 1991, they fully split. What the Soviet Union lost was its spheres of influence. So what do you expect Russia to lose? Are they going to lose their poor country? No. They're going to lose their spheres of influence. And that's what was lost between Panium and Sunday Law that leaves it so weak. And we considered the spheres of influence when we talked about Ptolemy and Seleucus up in this story here. They're not fighting over Egypt or Babylon. They're fighting over spheres of influence. At Panium, they're fighting over Kol Syria for this sphere of influence. And whether it's 1989 or 91 to 91 or Panium to or Sunday Law, it never goes past the neck. So in this battle, it never goes past the neck. It never has to. So Russia's not going to destroy the United States, and the United States is not going to destroy Russia. Because at Panium, all the king of the north took was Cold Syria. And down here, up to the border of Egypt. It didn't take Egypt. It just wanted its sphere of influence. This is one of the reasons it's important for us to be following the news, because if we want to see this war being played out, we need to look to Afghanistan, Venezuela, these different countries. And when we do that, we see that much of the world is divided into two spheres of influence. I tried to find a good map that would show it. This doesn't do it at all. It's just a world map, but I really tried to find a good map that would do it, and I was struggling. But most of the world is divided into two spheres of influence, Russia and then the US. So some of them still feel powerful enough that they can try, let's see, I missed something. And when we do that, we see that much of the world is divided into two spheres of influence. Some of them still feel powerful enough that they can try to play both sides. So when Russia wants to control a territory or nation, they try to play both sides. But most of the world doesn't have that freedom, and they're coming under the influence of the United States or Russia. And as they begin to see both the countries exhibit a dictatorship, it makes that decision more difficult. And a lot of these countries are afraid. So what is happening right now looks disconnected, but it's intimately connected between this war between the King of the North and the King of the South.
Sister Elaine, you know what just came to my mind? Is that, so they're fighting over spheres of influence, right? And then when we see the United States rise up again, they get to the borders, they get what they want, those spheres of influence. That's power. That's like over the world. So they just take over, because there's two superpowers, right? You have United States and Russia, and then United States takes over Russia's spheres of influence, and then they have power over all of those influences. And then it makes sense for it to even be that way, because then you have the papacy coming in, right? And then that's how the papacy gets influence over the world. Isn't that interesting? Because they take over, because they beat, there's that a fight between King of the North and the counterfeit, and then Seleucus reigns, the papacy reigns for that, that moment, and it's just really interesting that they have that control through those spheres of influence, because they win over the United States, if that makes sense. Sorry, but it's just really interesting because that's how they get their influence.
By control,
I don't know.
Yeah.
Huh? That's how I'm seeing it, but I don't know.
What actually happens in the battle? Was it between Antigonus and Seleucus?
That's the Babylonian War that happens between Panium and Sundela.
Right, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Who wins that war again, or like what was the outcome?
Seleucus, and that's
Seleucus.
the Seleucus dynasty. Seleucid dynasty.
Okay.
Because that's Panium. Panium to Sundela is the battle between those two King of the Norths.
That's the Babylonian War?
That's the Babylonian War.
Which makes sense because they're both Babylon.
Yeah. One's the daughter and one's the mother.
Okay.
So 1989 can tell us the story of Raphia and Panium, depending on which thread we pull. Did everybody now follow that? Unlike me, it took forever. Everybody understands that, how Raphia and Panium both are a story of 1989?
Yeah, it's in my head, but if you want to kind of just review
I don't.
time one more time.
Explain the Raphia one.
1989 to Raphia is the 30 years on the line of the priests.
Oh, that's it?
And then 1989 being lined up with Panium is the history of the King of the South.
Gotcha.
Want me to go back to that slide real quick?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Right here. So you have 1989 to Raphia. This is the story of the priests. And the line of the priests, the 30 years, ends here at Raphia. Okay. Then when you look at Daniel 11:40 part B, and you find the history of the King of the South, you find that there was a deadly wound and a death in the first verse of the, or did I say that wrong? Sorry, my screen's gonna change here. There we go. So you have we learned that there's a deadly wound of death, but we also know there's a resurrection, and that was in a previous slide. So if we know with the king of the north that there was a deadly wound and a death and the resurrection, we know that by compare and contrast, this king of the south would have a deadly wound of death and a resurrection. So in the line of in Daniel 11:40 part B, you see that the king of the south, 1989, receives a deadly wound and then a death, the destruction of the Soviet Union. So following the pattern of the king of the north, you would see a resurrection. So there's this resurrection in here with Russia that then comes to a deadly wound at Panium, and you get the deadly wound, and you get this from multiple stories, but when you go to Pyrrhus, you get the death of Pyrrhus at the Battle of Beneventum. And then you're able to link that, make these connections with those battles, which that's why those battles were showed, Heraclea, Asculum, and Beneventum, to show you where the king of the south dies, and that's at Panium. So you have this history here, these 30 years. 1989 becomes the story of Raphia for the priests, but 1989 becomes the story of Panium for the king of the south. Did that help?
Yes.
Okay. So 1989 and Panium are telling the same story, as she says, depending on which thread you want to pull. So we compared and contrasted Daniel 11:40, and we saw the story of the deadly wound and a death, but we also saw this isn't just a deadly wound and a death. It's also described as 1798 and 1799, and we are saying here that the papacy went into captivity and then it died in captivity. So when we consider the story of captivity, we couldn't compare and contrast the king of the north and the king of the south, because this is the story of the papacy. It's a church, it's Satan's kingdom. So if we were to consider Satan's kingdom going into captivity, we can't take that to the king of the south, because the king of the south is no one's kingdom except their own. So if we're going to see it as captivity, we need to go to another story that tells of captivity, and that's the story of Israel. So instead of comparing and contrasting the king of the north and overlaying him with the king of the south, so that was our first model, to overlay the king of the north and the king of the south, compare and contrast. And this story tells the story of the deadly wound, death, and then a resurrection. But then there's another story that we'll tell. And does everybody follow this part, though, that the king of the south does not go into captivity? When you use the word captivity, you have the deadly wound and a death can apply to the king of the south, but you can't apply captivity. Why can't you apply captivity to the king of the south?
Because king of the south is nobody's it's not under Satan's rule.
Right, he has no boss.
Yeah, he has no boss.
There's no one to put him in captivity.
Yeah.
So to compare and contrast captivity, then you compare the captivity of Israel to the papacy. So our second one was to take Babylon, Satan's kingdom, and overlay it with Israel. So you have Babylon overlaid with Israel, God's kingdom. The first one will tell us the story of death, deadly wound, and death. The second one will pick up the concept of captivity. It also comes in two parts: a deadly wound and a death, and go into captivity and die in captivity. Both concepts have two steps. And what Ellen White describes, what was fulfilled in 1798, she quotes the verse in Revelation 13 that uses both things, deadly wound and captivity. The only one that she says was fulfilled in 1798, she talks about the deadly wound, but she talks also about captivity. He that led into captivity must go into captivity. But there is the first part of that verse, which she also quoted, where she says, he that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. And she can give us the story of captivity. She didn't talk about the death because this isn't 1798. The death wasn't in 1798. The death was in 1799. So there's two concepts to get out of this and out of what she says. There's a deadly wound and a death, and then a resurrection, because the deadly wound would be healed. Compare and contrast. That would happen with both the king of the north and the king of the south. But the king of the south doesn't have a boss. So when the king of the north, you can see, goes into captivity, the king of the south does not go in captivity. So two separate themes. So you compare and contrast Babylon with Israel, with captivity and dying in captivity, and the king of the north and the king of the south with the death and the deadly wound, a deadly wound and a death.
May I ask a question,
Uh-huh.
Sister Elaine? So I understand what you're saying about the King of the South being his own power, so to speak, and not being able to go into captivity to Satan. But that would just be on one application, right? Because at the end, there's only two classes of people. So Putin doesn't go into purgatory of some kind. He would end up eventually being either, right, one or the other class.
Right. Those people would wind up on either one side or the other.
Right. I guess I was struggling kind of with that concept. But that's just, we're looking at it in this application. But if we were talking about the two classes of people that get divided and separated at the end of the time, Putin would still fall into one of those two classes, right?
Yeah, and think about it as the straight and narrow path. Few there are that find it, right? So all these truths are leading a people to the kingdom of God. They're taking us through step by step through a process of sifting out those that want to stay on the left or the right, so to speak. You know what I mean?
Yes.
You're going to hear a voice that says, not to look to the left or the right, but it's in Isaiah. I know I shared that somewhere recently, but where about those that are, not to go to the left or the right, but that you're going to hear that voice saying, this is the way, walk ye in it. But I thought it was interesting. It references the left or the right, but then you'll hear that voice, because what do we see happening now? We see the left and the right pulling pulling people to the left or pulling people to the right. But God's people are going to be his people. My sheep hear my voice and they follow me. His sheep are going to hear that voice that says, this is the way, walk ye in it. So they won't be on the left and they won't be on the right. They're going to walk in the narrow path, and it'll take them. And along the way, you have people that wind up on either the left or the right, but even whether they're on the left or the right, they're lost.
Yeah, both are ditches.
Right. That's true.
Yeah. So true. Thank you for explaining that.
So when we compared and contrasted Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom,
I think someone is trying to say something.
go ahead.
I was gonna ask a question, but I feel like probably the same old question that I always ask.
We're all there.
Yeah, so I guess because there's a lot of videos that are out and I'm still not caught up. So I'm just curious, like I'm still hung up on the Babylonian War, that time frame, Panium to Sunday Law. We know that the king of the south basically is defeated in that time. But the studies from last year were showing that the sixth kingdom transitioning to the seventh kingdom is the United States over the United Nations.
Faded out.
Lucas, I don't understand how. Oh, sorry,
Brother
did I fade
Jonathan,
out?
yeah, say that again, because you were we didn't hear that part.
Oh, which, like the whole thing, or?
No, I think your question is about with the transition, what do we do with the UN?
Yeah, well, not so much the UN. Like, how is it that the United States is transitioning from sixth to seventh kingdom at Sunday Law, but the papacy is also becoming. The papacy is the eighth kingdom still, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're both alive at the same time, and they both have power at the same time.
The 7th and the 8th at the same time.
and
Yeah.
if you look at Revelation 17, that's where the 10 kings, which are a kingdom, give their power 1 hour to the beast,
Which beast?
the papacy.
Okay, the papacy.
The papacy.
So are they both ascending at the same time?
Yeah, they're both ascending at the same time.
How do you know it's to the papacy, though?
The papacy is the beast.
I think from
Wait,
Revelation
if you're-
17.
If you're talking about Revelation 13, when you're talking about the image and the beast,
No, I'm talking about Revelation 17.
so but there's two beasts.
Yeah, it's 17 verse 5, I think, is the one where what is it, that they each get an hour, or is it 4?
But remember what I was saying earlier, and I think it was the early writings I was reading, but there's a distinction between the beast and the image.
But that story is the story of Revelation 13. And the beast that makes that image, that's the beast of the United States. Right? Revelation 13,
Right.
part 2, that second beast, that beast is the United States. The United States makes that image, which is church and state combination in the United States. But
Right.
the other beast is the beast that is not, and yet will be also, because its deadly wound is going to be healed. So you have two beasts that are going to be alive at the same time.
Right. Right. But one of them prevails over the other.
So I
Revelation
guess
17 tells us that the 10 kings, which is that transition from the 6th to the 7th, the 7th is those 10 kings, that they give their power 1 hour to the beast. What were you going to say, Jonathan?
I'm just wondering the capacity at which they're both in power. Like when we look at the United States, they have an army. We know the papacy doesn't have an army, but the battles aren't physical battles either, even between the king of the north and the king of the south. So when we're looking at the papacy elevating from Panium to Sunday law, it's going to be in persuasion, right? It's not, they're not, like, their sphere of influence is not going to be over any specific country in the way that the United States has spheres of influence. It'll be over individuals. Like, the way that I've seen it is that the United States is going to be this far right entity that is going to push people, you know, people that believe in liberty and all these things. They're going to be pushed away, and they're going to run to this second beast.
I thought Tess says that the papacy is going to gain in political sway or influence or power or something like that.
Well, Jonathan's I think on the right track as well, because that's what I was going to say here in just a second, because you're going to have that far right. This is the Babylonian War, and it's a battle for your mind, and the far right is trying to win your mind, and the far left, or the liberal of the papacy, is trying to win your mind. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
and when you put on top of that this coronavirus and whatever is going to come follow it, what is the message of the papacy basically going to be telling? Love one another.
Well, when you look at the two, like the United States and the papacy they're both represented as kings of the north. So they're both Satan's entities. So Satan is using one entity to drive one entity to catch people in one ditch, but it's driving all the others to run to the papacy in the other ditch. The papacy is going to counterfeit this movement, and this movement and the papacy are both going to be speaking about liberty, right? But the liberty that the papacy is going to be speaking about is going to be incorrect. I have this idea, and I could be wrong, I just want to throw it out there, that the United States in some form is going to be persecuting the papacy, because the papacy is a counterfeit of this movement. And if we're going to be persecuted, then they also have to be persecuted. And when people see that the Pope is going to stand up and say, you know, speak his words about liberty and love and kindness and all this stuff, and the United States, you know, Trump is, as far as I can understand, he's not a friend of the Pope, although it seems like Pence might be. So I don't understand that aspect. But if people are pushed, like in Revelation 13, it says that the second beast causes those to worship the first beast. It doesn't say, you know, like Adventists always believe that that means that the United States is going to set up the papacy in some way. I think what it means is it's going to push people towards the papacy because that's the only alternative.
Cause and effect.
Effect. And so the papacy is just an idea. I have a feeling that they might end up being persecuted as well by the United States. So you'll have the hardline right wingers persecuting the left wingers because the papacy doesn't actually have an army. But then you have the 10 kingdoms that are going to give an hour to the papacy. So it's almost like, I don't know if I made any sense, but go ahead.
No, I was just thinking as you were going through that of Daniel 11:45, and I don't know, but because I don't fully understand it myself, but and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. I don't know, but you're going to have because what do the Republicans and the conservatives stand for? They stand for slavery, right? Oppression, all the things that we're going to be standing against. The papacy is going to stand against those things, but be the false side of that.
Yeah, even the Pope comes out and speaks in behalf of homosexuals.
Right.
So you're right, Jonathan. He will have that liberal side will have a counterfeit message to our message.
The papacy also stands for globalism, whereas you can see that the United States is increasingly standing for nationalism. And so the United Nations is globalism. They are multicultural or multilateral, whatever you want to call it.
She says that Trump, it's a fight. She says Trump doesn't give up without a fight. Well, that's the Babylonian War that takes place between Pani and Sunday Law. He doesn't give up without a fight.
Yeah, but that kind of makes sense because if the Pope, if the papacy is persecuted, and then I don't know, all of that thought, but if that's correct or not, but if the papacy is persecuted, and that's one of the ways in which they kind of get some kind of attention or whatever, people seeing that, and then they're like, whoa, they're right, and all of that kind of stuff, that's still taking spheres of influence. I'm still thinking that part of that with the papacy gaining control is through getting that spheres of influence that the King of the North gained from Russia, as well as its own that they had. So and when I mean spheres of influence, that's the mind, that's really the mind.
Yeah, the ultimate sphere of influence.
Yeah, that's the ultimate.
Yeah. So Adriana, did you have anything to say? Because you had comments about what I was saying about Revelation 17. I want to hear your thoughts.
I want to know what beasts the 10 kings are giving power, but I'm going to have to look back into it. I just know that in Revelation 13, the beast was the United States, and it made an image also.
Yeah, it does make an image because it becomes the image. It is the image.
In Revelation 17 of verse 11 and 12. Oh, sorry. I was cut out there for a second.
Go ahead, because I was going to pull it up too.
In 17 verse 11 and 12, because I'm just trying to figure it out myself, it says, if you look at 12 first, it says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So then you jump back to find out what beast is talking about in the next verse, in the first verse, and it says, then the beast that was and is not, and even is the 8th, is of the 7 and goes into perdition. So it would have to be the papacy, wouldn't it?
Because that's the one that goes into perdition. And it's go to the end of the chapter, and I think you can see the same thing.
But it's also the 8th. It's also the 8th kingdom. So the 7th kingdom would be beast number 2 from Revelation, and the 8th kingdom would be beast number 1 from Revelation 13. If
verse 17, for God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and agree to give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled.
So that beast that it's talking about is being identified in verse 11. You have to keep going back until you know which beast it's talking about.
Yeah, Revelation 17 is if you ever sit down, I have a few times, never all the way, never do I get all the way through, but you have to keep retracing back. And as you keep doing that and you go forward, you find that you come into dead ends many times on what we regularly or had always understood about it.
Yeah, because the preconceived ideas kind of mess it up.
And the 10 kings, the 10 horns, which are that seventh kingdom, which are the 10 kings, which are a kingdom, they're upon the beast. So they're one of the heads of the beast. They're going to hate the whore. We know who the whore is because it already defines her. That's Babylon, right? The woman, she's the whore. And they're going to make her desolate and naked and burn her with fire. So that's for another story.
You said the 10 kings were a part of the beast. Which verse were you
No,
referring
the
to?
10 kings are one of the heads, the 7 heads. They're the 7th head.
So the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns, right?
Yeah, I think so. But you have to go trace that back too, all the way back to chapter 12, 13, and then 17 to follow that path. And I don't have it all clear in my mind, but you have to trace it back because each time it's there in chapter 12, it's there in chapter 13, yeah, and it's there in chapter 17.
So the beast and the woman are the same thing, right?
Well,
That's where it gets.
yeah, that's where
Because the
because
10
the
kings
beast is a
give their
kingdom.
power to the beast, but then the woman is the papacy, but the beast is the papacy.
But she's running the entire government at this time. I don't know. But what we do know thus far,
I think that what we were talking about initially, when you're going down to the kings giving 1 hour with the beast, you don't need to get confused with what's being said in verse 1, 2, 3, and 4, because it's actually identifying in verse 11 the beast that it's talking about. So it's a new thought, right? Starting probably in verse 10. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7 that goeth into perdition. So you don't need to get caught up with the beast that's in verse 3 with the woman on its back, because this one's telling you it's the 8th kingdom.
the beast,
Sister Christine,
you have the beast and you have the image. The beast is a union of church and state with the papacy writing, controlling the state.
But you're not getting the image being mentioned in chapter 17 anywhere. So it's just referring to the 2 beasts. There's 2 beasts, one from
Right.
Revelation 13, 1 to 11, and then the other beast from 12 to 18. Revelation 13, 12 to 18.
But the beast itself is this union of church and state, which you can show that there's a union of church and state all the way through every one of those kingdoms is a king of the north.
I understand that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that in verse 11, it's telling you, by giving you the order of the 8 kingdoms,
Uh-huh.
it's telling you which one of those 8 it is.
And which one are you saying it is?
Well, the beast that was, you have to go from the perspective of John when he's writing this, right? So he's writing this, he's looking back, as far as I understand, when he was writing this, he was writing it from the perspective, I think it was said before, from after the 1260 years, looking
Right.
backwards.
Right.
And he's saying the beast that was and is not. So after the 1260, it was not anymore. It says even he is the 8th and is of the 7 and goeth into perdition. So at that time, the United States was, it couldn't be the is not. So it had to be talking about the papacy because there's no other beast that comes back.
And that's what I'm saying. Is if the beast was and is not, what does it mean to be is not in relation to the study that we're actually doing right now? Dead.
Yeah.
It was dead. And then it was resurrected because it's dead and it was healed.
Sister Elaine, Sister Christine put something in the chat that's very interesting. And could you expound on your thought a little bit? Sister Christine, I'm going to say it. The woman cannot ride herself. Elder Parmenter gave Elder Parmenter gave that the image is a proxy of the beast. You want to say more, Sister Christine?
So he was trying to explain in one of the presentations, the School of the Prophets from Germany, he was trying to expound on the difference between the beast and the image of the beast. And that the image of the beast, it's like having a representative of the king, right? So the representative can go to other countries and say this and that, and whatever the words that he says are from the king, but he's not exactly the king. He's the representative. He's the proxy, right? So the woman cannot be both, and the woman and what she's writing cannot both be the papacy because the woman cannot ride herself, right? But she, one of them's the image, right? So it's a proxy. So they're not exactly the same, but there's the proxy, the image speaks for the beast. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
The woman isn't the beast. The beast is the union of church and state.
Right, right. The beast is the union. Yes.
I thought that was the image.
The images.
Yeah, but the image has done the same thing. You look at the United States, they've done the same thing. You've got church and state united. They're doing the same thing the papacy did.
I just want to know, did he talk about who the proxy is, Christine?
No, he was going through describing the difference, not making an application. And this was just in, you guys have watched, well, like I'm sure Elaine has, it was just recent, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
Germany was, seems like eons ago.
I know,
It was
right?
in Portugal. Yeah, it's his recent ones when he's going over the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and it's the one, or Portugal or Germany, however you want to talk it. They're in Portugal. I mean, they're in Portugal, but they're translating in German. So, yeah, those videos.
I think it's the one, I can't exactly remember, but I think it's the one where after Sister Kathy had her presentation, but we didn't get to see it, and they're talking about.
Oh, that was really interesting. That was number 53 or 54.
Right, so it's the information after they talked about the United States and the three-pronged government that we had after that part in that same presentation. So it's called something like everything else, or a bunch of different things. I can't remember the title of it, but I think it's that video.
Oh, okay. That recent? I even just heard that recent. Okay. Shows how much I can hear when I'm, oh, wow. So,
Yeah, it was either 53, 54, 55. I can't remember. I'll try to find it.
yeah, they're up to 58 now. So let me see, 57, 56. It would be 55. I'm pretty sure it would be 55. I think that's the one where that was really fascinating too, to listen to the what was said about the Constitution, that the Constitution was actually designed by the founders, maybe not purposely, but had flaws from the beginning.
So what was
The flaws in the beginning were to, as long as you had a person who was not of their own self-interest and self-motivation, and preserve the interest of others, that the Constitution would work. But when you have a person in there that wants to serve their own interests, then the Constitution shows its flaws, because that person is going to use the power that is given to the executive office for himself and not for the benefit of others, for the good of others.
Wow.
And so, and then he was talking about how, or maybe it was Kathy was, but we didn't see that. We'll have to have her teach on a Zoom lesson one day. But he was talking about how there was one point that I missed. Maybe Christine knew where I was going there with that, with the failure of it to be, that people have, and I've heard this before said, that people always have believed that, though that could happen, that it would correct itself. The problem would correct itself when you go into the next election. Say that president gets 2 terms, but then when it's all over, it will correct itself, because the pendulum, and then he didn't use the word pendulum, but then it's going to swing back the other way. So it would correct, the problem would be corrected, because there's limitations on the terms of the president. But we're at a place in time now where we have somebody so serving himself, I think, beyond anybody has ever done, that it's not going to correct itself.
The problem with our government is that it's based on the honor system.
Right.
And so if you don't have somebody who's honorable and who is self-serving, then they're not going to follow the rules, and it's going to, this pendulum's going to swing, like you said.
Yeah.
Right. And there was discussion in that there's the process of impeachment. But when we heard from Elder Ted, she said that even if Trump was out of office, was kicked out of office, it would take a generation to change what was done
What
did
he's
she
done,
say?
the damage
Yeah.
that he's done.
Yeah, the damage that was done. Yeah.
If you look at the
Yeah.
Republican Party, you'll see that they have a sense of how they can have power now and the way that they can manipulate the system. So I agree with that. I was thinking about that yesterday. I was like, even if Trump was gone, you still have people like McConnell and all these people that are in power that would not let it go.
And all
Even
their judges, all the judges, that's the key thing too.
Judge-
All
yeah.
those judges that were appointed, far right judges that are put, and those are career, I don't know, the Supreme Court is lifelong. I don't know that the other ones are lifelong, but they're maybe they are lifelong, maybe somebody knows that. So
No.
these judges are put in place and they're there for 30, 40 years.
Right, they're not elected. They're given
Appointed.
power by the president, so the president's the only one who can change them.
Yeah. So, and he just appointed one to the highest next to the Supreme Court. Is that, maybe somebody remembers this so that I don't say it wrong, but to the appellate court, the highest of the appellate courts. And it's a young guy that's only 39 that apparently in a previous appointment, he was by the American Bar Association, they said that he's not qualified for the job based on his age, his lack of experience, and many other things. I can't remember what it was, but he has extreme far right views. That just came out a couple of days ago, that he's now been appointed to be the judge in the highest of the appellate courts.
And this is one of the tactics that they're saying, is that they're picking younger judges so that they'll be in there
He'll be
longer.
there for a long time, yeah. So you can see the stage being set up before the Babylonian War.
Yeah. But yeah, when I look at the Babylonian War, it's a war, so they're in opposition. They're not in agreement. Like, I was wondering the other day, because Pence had visited the Pope, and apparently he had spent a lot of time in private with him, more than what most people actually get. And I was thinking, well, okay, what's going on there? But I don't want to get confused on that. We know that the Babylonian War is going to be a battle between them, the two. They're not in an alliance. So when Sunday Law comes, whatever it looks like, the Seleucid dynasty, I just find it confusing, because you have the Seleucid dynasty, but at the same time you have the U.S. Supreme, as it used to be referred to.
As a supreme superpower, only superpower. Yeah, because for the Babylonian War, what was Antigonus and Seleucus fighting for?
Spheres of influence?
Well, no, they were, what's it called?
Oh, what?
Well, I thought that when I was going through those studies, I thought that oh, never mind, because that was the Babylonian War. But Seleucus was only taken over, was taking opportunity to it was always a struggle for Seleucus to get his kingdom settled, and then finally I forget, because now I'm forgetting, when Antigonus went to go, and I probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Antigonus went to go help Demetrius or something like that, then so that's when Seleucus went to go take a part in Babylon, that one area, and then that's where he fought to have his dynasty, the I forget, because he went to go.
So it's called the Babylonian War. You have the mother and the daughter. They're both the king of the north. The king of the north is Babylon, right? So they're both the king of the north. One's the mother, one's the daughter. What are they fighting over? It's called the Babylonian War.
Yeah, that territory.
They want to be the king of Babylon.
Right.
Well, can I put it in terms that I heard Elder Tess put it in?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a marriage. So the state is the husband and the church is the wife. And
right.
That's why I thought it was a perfect answer, because the reason why you can have two kings of the north at the same time is because they got divorced, but they both kept the same last name.
Ooh, yeah.
Saying that in a video. So you have two kings of the north, but one is the woman or the church, which is the papacy, and the other one is the husband. So they're both alive at the same time, but they both represent different aspects of whatever spiritual life or versus state life, whatever it is.
Wow.
But the woman wants her land. She wants her, piece of the
alimony. It's alimony. Wow, that's actually actually helps to make it make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that context, then is she saying that the papacy and the United States are married?
Yeah,
They're not married, they're divorced.
of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's the same issue you had with what was it, with the
They divorced in '89.
so when the papacy uses a state and that state agrees to be used by the papacy, they're in union, right? So you can look at that as a marriage. But when they're not acting together anymore and one isn't listening to the other, then you can see that they're not in union, so they're divorced in a spiritual symbolic application.
So they're fighting out in the courts a divorce battle over the
Yeah, and then they're also fighting for custody of the children, and
Right.
that's the daughters. So
Right.
it's a nice big happy family problem.
And 1989 would mark the divorce, I suppose, wouldn't it? Because they were married. If you go
Exactly.
back, the only time that they were really married was in that agreement, and that seemed to be when things fell apart.
Yeah. So I don't know if, because the Third Diadochi War is, and the Babylonian War coming in right after it. I don't know if it shows that they're in union at that point. I just know that from that model, you have Seleucus and Antigonus. They're not allies. They have each their own separate territories from each other because they battled, and it was through fighting that Seleucus won Babylon back. And eventually then Seleucus unites with Ptolemy and Lysimachus and everyone to go kill Antigonus. But I don't know if that comes in later because you have an alliance with the papacy and then it destroys the state part. So I don't know if that comes in later. But her Diadochi War model ended at the Sunday Law where Seleucus takes power too.
Well, so here's another thing to throw into it, but this would be after the Sunday Law then, because back when you go back, you tell the end from the beginning, and you go back to when the papacy was coming onto the scene, you have the 10 divisions of Rome, right? And at the end, you're going to have the 10 divisions of the world, these 10 kings. So you had 10 kings back then, and you're going to have 10 kings now that are all going to be under subjection of the papacy. Is that correct? Maybe that's too far to go ahead because that's after the Sunday Law.
Three were uprooted, weren't they, in that time as well?
Yeah. I don't know how that fits in either. Okay, well, let's get back to this. Good study. Good discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more thing, Sister Elaine, before you go, because I'm still thinking about Islam, though, because if Islam helps God's people carry out their work, and at that time you have Seleucus rising up, in power too at that time. So how is Islam affecting the papacy?
I don't have that answer, but if anybody wants to take on those notes from Brother Atabo and go through them and work on studying through them and presenting them, because Islam is a part of it, and Islam offers the restraint for God's people to go forward and do the work.
You guys remember that when Islam is in power, the papacy is losing power, so it's a big distraction for the papacy. And instead of their eye being on destroying God's people, their eye is on having to deal with Islam.
Thank you.
That would all be like post Sunday Law, right? That we would see that, or
that's post Sunday Law.
Yeah. And it gives us a chance to do that work, but then when Islam is finally dealt with, then they turn their sights on us, and then death decree and all that good stuff. So.
wow.
I thought that Elder Tess said that Islam, Seleucus, and the Nabateans. Seleucus and Nabateans. So Seleucus is symbolized by the papacy. The Nabateans by Islam was a distraction to Antigonus, which means the papacy and the Islam is a distraction to the United States. I think that's what she said.
Yeah, I think you're right.
She did say that. She did say that. She did say that.
Islam is always a distraction against the armies of Rome, and Seleucus is not the armies of Rome. Like the U.S. is going to be the oppressing power, it seems, in that time. So, and they're going to be out to oppress those that are in opposition to them, which is going to be both the papacy and this movement. So Islam would basically be distracting the U.S. from both the papacy and this movement, I would assume. Or maybe I'm going too far with that.
Okay, let's get back to the study. Good conversation, though.
Okay.
So when we compared and contrasted Satan's kingdom and God's kingdom, we went quite quickly and we went over the history of modern Babylon compared to modern Israel. Israel went into captivity, and when they came out as modern Israel, how many parts did they come out in? So when Israel went into captivity, they came out as modern Babylon. How many parts? When did modern Israel come out or emerge in history? That was in 1798. Modern Israel comes out. They come out in 2 parts. So we have the Millerite history. This is the Alpha, and this is supposed to be an Omega. Sorry. But it's also an Alpha in our line, but it's supposed to be an Omega. So this is the Alpha, and then there is the Omega, the 144,000, both beginning at the time of the end. 1989 is modern Israel. It comes out of captivity, 1798, but it's an existence. In its existence as modern Israel, there's a captivity in between. So you have the 1260 here, ending, that captivity ending, in the story of the 126, this captivity ending. So the end of the 1260 and the 1989 coming out, it's the 126. So you have the ending, but what we're going to see is there's a middle history here. So when we come to modern Babylon, it went into captivity in 1798. It was in captivity in 1798. In 1773, you had 25 years before the Catholic Church, she forgot her prophetic mission. When you had the Jesuits here, she forgot her prophetic mission. She was in a Laodicean condition. She chose her temporal wealth and prosperity. She saw herself rich and increased with goods. And what need does she have to bother with those people that she's trying to kill? She'd rather just rest and enjoy her wealth. And when she does that, she disobeys her boss and goes into captivity. And this was rebellion. So you had the Jesuits here. The Catholic Church disobeys her boss and goes into captivity. So rebellion is followed by a period of captivity. It began in 1798. Without proving it in detail, it comes out in 1899. 1798, the beginning of the increase of knowledge. And this is the work of William Miller. So you've got modern Babylon and modern Israel. You both go into captivity. They're both going to come out of captivity. 1899 is the beginning of an increase of knowledge. So we have 1899 here, there's an increase of knowledge, but we also have a 1798, a beginning of an increase of knowledge for Miller. So Pacelli and Miller. Pacelli is made a priest and he begins studying the Code of Canon Law. William Miller has completed his studies in 1818. Pacelli completes his studies in 1917 when the Code of Canon Law is completed. And the Code of Canon Law is the Latin Codex Juris Canon, I don't know if I can say that one, official compilation of ecclesiastical law promulgated in 1917 and again in a revised form in 1983 for Roman Catholics of the Latin Rite. The new Code of Canon Law was a systematic arrangement of the ecclesiastical law then in force. So that was the work of Pacelli to the increase of knowledge for the Catholic Church. The increase of knowledge is this putting together the Code of Canon Law. He finishes his work in 1917. 1 year, 101 years behind. You see there's 101 years behind here. So the process began in 1798 and ended in 1818. And in 1818, William Miller makes the statement that he makes in about 25 years and from studying the prophecies. Pacelli began studying in 1899 and completed in 1917 when he has the code published that he's been working on with Cardinal Gasparri. And these are some of the core group of people. We discussed his brother earlier in the previous study, Pacelli's brother, and the work that they did. And his brother did the work of the Lateran Treaty with Cardinal Gasparri. So they're doing a work within the papacy to resurrect it. So this work that Pacelli begins here is the work that is an increase of knowledge to try to resurrect the Catholic Church. The same month, we also have the 3 visions of Fatima. And this was his sister, Lucia, I think. So 1917, you have the vision of Fatima. And Lucia then becomes a nun. 3 visions. fear, take down the king of the south, and then judgment. Satan wants to bring a message to his church, and it took the papacy hundreds of years to accept a pope that wasn't Italian. So if you were to consider the politics of this, you have a church in Italy that only accepted Italian popes for about 800 years. They also don't allow their women to speak. You would never see a woman up on the front. So why would Satan go to a young girl about 10 years old in Portugal in an unknown location, nowhere prominent, and give her message to take to the give her a message to take to the church? Why would Satan go to this young girl to give the message to give to the Catholic Church? Why didn't he go to the Vatican and speak to his Pope? In 1798, while these messages are going to the leaders of the Protestant churches, you have the three messages going to the Protestant churches. The leaders are in rebellion, they're not listening, and they are bypassed. They don't listen and they are bypassed in 1798. And it takes time for that to develop and be recognized. So you're going to see the same thing here. In 1899, the leaders of the Catholic Church are also bypassed. If you read that history, a good book to read is Hitler's Pope. It covers some of this history in good detail. From Pacelli's birth, it traces his early years. It discusses 1899. It discusses Fatima, the impact on Pacelli. It discusses the popes in this history. Not necessarily good men, but they are not doing the work that they are supposed to be doing. And they would not listen to these messages from Portugal because they were afraid of them. The leadership was afraid of these messages. Why? So why is the leadership of the Catholic Church afraid of these messages? What the leadership was afraid of is, why would Mary send a message to Portugal and these children and not to them? That's their fear. There's a rejection and they know it. So they know that they're being rejected. If Fatima is true, these messages are going straight to the church and they do not have control over it. And the popes in this history are well aware that they are losing control.
Oh, so okay, so in this period, just like in the Adventist church, the leaders are being passed by, right?
Correct. By the sixth apparition of Fatima, about 70,000 people arrived on the day it was predicted. 70,000 Catholics came to this tiny town to catch a glimpse of these three children and try to experience what was happening there. That was in October of 1917. So the first one was May, I believe. Is that correct? It was May. Is that correct? And that's in October of 1917. So the people are coming to this location, trying to see Lucia, trying to understand what's happening, and the papal government has absolutely no control over what is happening. So they take Lucia from Fatima and put her in a boarding school far away. They try to split her from the location, hoping people will stop making pilgrimages and drawing attention to this, because these three messages that were coming at this time were still secret, but they know that whatever is happening in Rome, they have no control. So you've got the same thing happening, like Sister Victoria just pointed out, within the Catholic Church, when Miller has his message and the Protestants reject it. And they're trying to get rid of those messages. And I thought I used to like to look at maps, but when you know history and then you start looking at maps, more things click. But it's interesting how close Fatima is to Lisbon. Isn't Lisbon where the great earthquake was?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have the little miniature here that this is Portugal, this is Spain, and you have France, I believe, right? And then you have Italy. We bring that up in our history, and the leadership of the churches have no control over those messages, so they begin to fight it. It looks different when you take it to the papal structure. It's a little bit more difficult to see in the overturning of leadership because they just have a continuous popes. And in this history, our history, you have a variety of people involved. But when you come to the Catholic Church, you don't quite have that same structure because they only answer to one man. So you don't have Miller and Snow down in the counterfeit. It's just Pacelli all the way through. It begins in 1899. He's made Pope on the eve of World War II. He has already gone through an alliance with Hitler. I got that one wrong all along. So eventually I think I have this corrected, but it should be Omega. And we come to October 22nd, 1844, and also you have 1945. And how did both of those end? They both ended in a disappointment. So looking at October 22nd, 1844, why is there a disappointment? Because the message of Samuel Snow that he gave was half right. The date was correct. We drew that out in a previous study. So he had the date right when he was giving the message that October 22nd, 1844 would be, when we're going to go on and say what he says, July 21, his prediction is given of a close of probation of October 22nd, 1844. But Samuel Snow does not say close of probation. What he says is that it's a second advent. So on July 21st, when he first, that's Boston, Concord, and Exeter, that he's giving a message that this is going to be the second advent. So a message is predicting the second advent, whereas in fact it was a close of probation. And did they have the light in that history to understand the difference? Yes, they did. Ellen White makes it clear that this was not because God withheld information, but the mistakes of his people. So they could have known the truth. It was the mistakes of the people. Samuel Snow was half right and half wrong. So we have a half right and a half wrong. When we come into the history prior to 1945, figure out where I'm at here, Pacelli understands his mission to defeat the Soviet Union. And he attempts that by going into union with Hitler. So in this period here, prior to 1945, Pacelli is going to go into, he's the one that becomes the Pope, Pope Pius XII. And he's the one that back here at the beginning, becomes a priest and gets the increase of knowledge, does the code of canon law. So now in here, he's going to recognize, okay, and he attempts that. He understands his mission to defeat the Soviet Union. He attempts that by going into union with Hitler. He tries to go into union with the United States, but the United States told him literally in a letter from Roosevelt, we disagree. Roosevelt told Pope Pius XII, your number one enemy is the Soviet Union and ours is Germany. So we're not going to agree. And despite so the United States is an enemy of Germany. They don't have the same enemy, so they're not going to agree. And despite whatever Pacelli tried to do, the USA was determined to fight Germany first. And it was Germany that Pacelli thought he needed an alliance with. So he was half right and half wrong. So you've got half right, half wrong here as well. He needed to defeat the Soviet Union, but he was impatient and he tried to attempt that with Germany, and that ended in a disappointment. It isn't until just after this date, after the end of World War II, we have the beginning of the Cold War. So we've got the Cold War beginning here. And what Pope Pius XII then did was to start to work with the US. They recognized their mistake in 1945 and they started to change their plan. They had the vision in the field. I don't remember the vision in the field, if somebody remembers that. Maybe later. I don't remember the vision in the field, and I didn't look that one up. They had the vision, and it must have been a previous study, but I'm not remembering it.
That was Hiram Edson's vision in the field, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's for our church, but this is talking about the Catholic Church.
Oh.
And they saw their mistake. So we talk about Reagan and John Paul II working together, but that's at the latter end of the history. Soon after the end of World War II, Pope Pius XII already begins working with the US. It didn't take him 40 years into the future for the papacy to see their mistake. So he begins working with the US here during the Cold War because he recognized his mistake. His mistake was aligning with Germany to try to defeat the Soviet Union. So Reagan and John Paul II, huh?
That makes a lot of sense, because just like how God's people here in our church would have had enough information to see that it wasn't the literal second coming, the papacy would have had enough information by then to see that the United States was the up and coming superpower that they can use against Russia.
Yeah.
And that was in 1930s, but they, for some reason, they decided not to. But by that point, the US was actively becoming a huge superpower. So
Yeah. So Reagan and John Paul II, the Unholy Alliance, it began actually in 1945 with Pope Pius XII. And the USA starts funneling millions of dollars into the Vatican to help them fight communism in Eastern Europe. And so this is the Alpha history.
Sister Lane, can I say something?
Uh-huh.
I don't want to throw a curve, but it's interesting because within that same history, there was America wasn't really, how do I want to say it? They weren't, they were still like strong in Protestantism. You know what I'm saying? That they weren't even wanting there to be a Catholic president, right? I'm trying to think at that point. No, because when did Kennedy get elected again? I'm trying
60-ish, 60, yeah, 60.
Oh, okay. So never mind, because that history already bridged because Kennedy did come before Reagan. So never mind. But I thought were they still strong in that at that time, or no? It had already been broken down, those barriers.
You talk about the United States, were they so strong, or you talk about
the United States, in that they didn't want Catholic involvement. It was like a bad thing. Like when Kennedy was their first Catholic president. Yeah, like that was like a no. But for some people that was a big no, a red flag, like, ooh, this is not good, for some people.
Yeah, but look, what this is telling us is that the United States was working with the papacy.
Right. So at this point, barriers had. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So at this point, the barriers had already been broken down for the papacy to even have that influence in there, for it to be, not as looked at as like, oh no, this is not right for it to happen or something like that. Like
they're working together to stop communism
mm-hmm.
in Eastern Europe, which is a result of what with the World War II. Somebody help me if I say something wrong here. But at the end of World War II, that's where Churchill, I was going to say Reagan, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin got together to divide up. And Stalin wanted to have some of those buffer countries to buffer him. And he wound up gobbling up Eastern Europe. And so they started to work together. So the Pope saw that, what was happening, and they were looking to spread communism. And the role of the role of the papacy was to stop the King of the South. Instead, the King of the South began to explode communism and spread it. And so then the United States and the Pope, the papacy, began to work to try to stop communism, fight communism in Eastern Europe.
I just wanted to say that when Reagan was trying to push his relationship with the Pope during his administration and trying to add that in, and because no one believed him, why are you talking about the Pope as someone to help take down communism? And in every single interview he did, he's like, I solidly believe that with the Pope's help, we can have an effect to bring down communism. So there were still some barriers there, but they were beginning to be broken down.
Yeah, so they definitely had those barriers with with what you're saying when Kennedy.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to remember, because I remember that during that period there was still that kind of barrier kind of going on there with papacy being involved and people not being so welcoming of that or something like that. I don't know. Can't remember all the history, but I remember that in the air, like, or something about that. But anyway, sorry, that's a different curve of tangent. Sorry.
No, but it is accurate to look at it, because even if the people in the country aren't interested in such a weird, strange type relationship with Rome, the fact that the leader just takes the whole country down that path. So you have the king of the.
So would it be that the United States and the United States was looking at, and I might use the wrong terminology, but communism is like an ideology, right?
Yep.
And then you have capitalism, an ideology, right?
Yep.
And
Yeah.
the papacy, they both had a common goal, and that was to stop communism.
Yeah.
So even though they may have been those memories of what the papacy was, they had a common goal to take down communism.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Sister Elaine. Yeah, that's good.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you.
I think what
I'm
we,
not smart enough to come up with that on my own.
yeah, I think the history that, I don't know if this is important, but the history, the organization, we have to remember, which organization in the United States, worked with the papal power to bring down communism. And it was the CIA. So, when we don't know much about the history of the CIA because of their secrecy, but from what I understand it's because of they're both wanting to bring down communism, it was the CIA that was mostly involved with the papacy to bring down communism.
That would make sense because it was covert operations that they were trying to do to get the Radio Free Europe in those satellite countries and to try to get people in there to change the minds of the people and work internally.
And that
Yes.
caused them to
The
bring
Cold War,
themselves
and
down. And that caused them to bring themselves down from the inside.
it was called a Cold War because there was no outward warfare. It was all internal and secretive. So, and information. So, I could
So
totally.
we talked about 1850 and 1950. 1850 being the Adventist line, 1950 going to be the line of the papacy. But then we came to another history in between these two. The Alpha and the Omega bookend another history. So you have an Alpha and Omega, and they bookend another history. So you've got 1989 and the Millerite history, and then you have the line of 144,000. But in the middle, you have this other history, which we talked about in the last study. And this one, we could go into more detail. I just want to look at 1886 and 1888. And there's an attempt here to fix the problems of the church. A message comes from Jones and Wagner. We discussed that Wagner last week when we did 2 weeks ago when we did Half Right, Half Wrong. And in conflict with him is Butler. And their argument is over the book of Galatians. So if everybody remembers that study from 2 weeks ago or from our own studies of watching all these presentations. But this is a history that is in between. They're trying to correct the problem. In 1886, Butler writes a pamphlet, The Law in the Book of Galatians. So Butler writes this pamphlet attacking Wagner in his position on righteousness by faith. Ellen White, in this history, she's very supportive of Wagner, but she says that neither have all the light, neither Butler nor Wagner have all the light on the issue. She demonstrates that they are half right and half wrong. We bring that down to the counterfeit in 1980 and 1989, as we discussed in World War II. The mission is the same, to defeat the King of the South. So 1989, the mission is to defeat the King of the South. We understand that 1863, we have 1850 and 1863 on church organization, and there's an issue over our prophetic message. They reject the prophetic message. 1950 is an attempt at revival. In 1962, a rejection of Fatima. So you have 1950 here, there's an attempt at revival, and then there's a rejection of Fatima and the prophetic message. They're starting to solve those problems when they come into the history of John Paul II, who recognizes Fatima, but he has an issue with the Jesuits in 1989. So you have here 1850, where the church is already going into a Laodicean condition. They reject the prophetic message. So there's an attempt at, this is when the 1850 chart came out, that was to go and give a loud cry, a revival attempt, and then a rejection of the message. So you have a revival attempt in 1950, and you have the rejection of Fatima.
What was John Paul's issue in 1989 with the Jesuits? Do you know?
We're going to go on to that.
Okay, perfect.
Let us remind ourselves how the Jesuits come into these histories. In 1773, the church is fighting the Jesuits. In 1989, remember that they chose their wealth instead of doing their job. and they chose wealth over the Jesuits, so the Jesuits were laid aside. 1989, they're still against the Jesuits. So who is the one who is supposed to be doing the work? The Jesuits are the ones that are actually supposed to be doing the work. And in 1989, you have this warfare between John Paul II and the Jesuits. And it's really over the traditional view. We went through that in the last study. Butler upheld the traditional view of the church in the book of Galatians. John Paul II upheld the traditional views of the church. Wagner is seen as being new and bringing in dangerous and radical ideas that oppose tradition. And it's the same problem with the Jesuits. They're seen as bringing in these radical ideas that oppose traditions. And look at what we have with Francis. He's a Jesuit, and he has those radical views and ideas. So 2 years previously, 1987, you have a book written by Malachi Martin, and it's on the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, and the betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. It talks about the Jesuits and says that they have betrayed the Catholic Church, and it's a direct attack on the positions. You know, and all the times all the stuff we've learned in the past, to think that what we thought about the Jesuits, and here the Catholic Church is totally against the Jesuits, and we think the Jesuits are the Catholic Church doing all the work, but they're two separate entities. With two separate, not two separate entities, but they're two separate beliefs. And one is conservatism and one is liberalism, and the Jesuits are that liberal side, and the conservative Catholics don't want it in there. So it talks about the Jesuits and says that they have betrayed the Catholic Church, and it is a direct attack on their positions. John Paul II was doing the right work, trying to defeat the King of the South. So his job was to defeat the King of the South. When you come into this history, they're half right and half wrong. So it was the Jesuits that were actually supposed to be doing the work. When we went to the story of Pyrrhus, we saw two histories. Pyrrhus, you had an Alpha and Omega, beginning and an end. We built a chart and had 3 battles over 4 histories. So you have the Heraclea, Asculum, Beneventum over 4 histories, and I'll have the 4th one there in a minute. So, but we went through 4 different histories. We built a chart, and what did the chart say? All of this is from the perspective of the King of the North when we talk about success and failure. So in 1844, you wouldn't talk about that as success for Satan. We take it from the perspective of the King of the North. The true King of the North is God. In 1945, we don't talk about that as a history of success for the Soviet Union. We approach it from the perspective of the papacy. It just makes more sense to do it that way. So we talk about failure and failure when we're talking about it from the perspective of the King of the North, because the papacy failed on 2 attempts, failed to do their job function. So when we looked at these 3 battles, we talked about success and failure. All of that is from the perspective of the King of the North. Whoever in that history is representing the King of the North, we're able to identify a pattern. In the Alpha history, from the perspective of the King of the North, the Alpha history, from the perspective of the King of the North, the first battle is success. The King of the North is success. The second battle is success, and the third is failure. So that should have been under here. So it's failure. Success for the King of the North, success for the King of the North, and failure for the King of the North. In the history of World War II, this is an Alpha history as well. You have August 1940, Operation Barbarossa in 1945. So you have a success, and then a failure for the King of the North. When we come to the history of the Omega, the first battle is failure, the second failure, and the third success. So the Alpha history, the King of the North is success, and then failure. And then in the Omega history, the King of the South is failure, and then there's a win for the King of the North. In the history of the Omega, the first battle, Heraclea, is failure. The second, Asculum, is failure. The third, Beneventum, is success. And it's these last 2 that have been recognized by the movement first. King of the North, failure at Raphia, success at Panium. And when we approached this graph, we also talked about who initiated each conflict. we again saw the exact same pattern. So the pattern is also between who initiates. So here you have the king of the south initiates, king of the north wins. The king of the north initiates, and the king of the north wins. The king of the south initiates, and the king of the north fails. I'm only now catching that mistake in this, so hopefully everybody's following that, where that failure needs to be. And I apologize for that. And if we were to take the story of Panium and we were to place it on 1945, is it success or failure? It's a failure in 1945. Success, success, failure. It's the history of Nazi Germany in World War II, and you overlay it over Panium. 1945 tells of Panium. 1945 is a disappointment and a failure because the message is half right and half wrong. But what is Panium then? So you have failure here, and you have failure here. 1844 is a disappointment and failure. The message was half right and half wrong. What we can't do is take the history of Macedonia in World War II and drop it wholesale onto our history. We can't do it with the counterfeit. We can't take 1945, drop it straight onto Panium, and make it look like a history of failure. And we know we can't do that with the counterfeit, so we shouldn't be doing it with the true. We shouldn't be taking 1844, this history here, which was failure and disappointment, and the prediction of Samuel Snow, which is half right and half wrong, and drop it into 2012, 2014, 2018. It's not half right and half wrong. In 1773, they're fighting the Jesuits, the churches, the Catholic Church fighting the Jesuits. By 1989, the Jesuits have a lot of influence again, but they're still fighting the Jesuits. What we need is a pope who is going to defeat the king of the south. Also, conveniently, he's a Jesuit. So we come into our history, Francis is a Jesuit. And that's what they need in order to defeat the king of the south. So this is an alpha history. This is what comes in between. So you have your alpha, you have your omega, and then you have this history that comes in between. You have failure, failure, and then success. This history comes in between is the half right, half wrong, half right, half wrong here as well, and half right, half wrong here. Now we have an omega history, and we're going to mark the end, 1945, as Panium. It's a success, complete and total. So Panium with Francis is a success. 1989, the beginning of the omega history, the end is 126. 1798 is the alpha, 1989 is the omega. I don't have 1989 in here. I pulled it out. So, or I do up here. I had it down below, but we brought it up here now. So you have the history here that's a history of failure, half right, half wrong. They don't have the message right. They don't have the message right here. They make a second attempt here. They make a second attempt here. There's a failure. They choose their, there's a failure here. There's a fight with the Jesuits. You also then have, when you get to the line of success, you've got Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit, and he knows and is going and will be the one that will defeat the king of the south. So that's the thing that kind of is like, I'm really pondering that, because the lines show us that it's the Catholic Church that defeats the king of the south. We come down into the history of the counterfeit. We're not going to be hard about this date when the papacy comes out of its scattering stage, because if we do address this, we would need to go in and prove it. We'll just say that it's already happened. He's already come out of his scattered state. 1989, we begin to be regathered. So the Catholic Church is being regathered. We're being regathered. In the history of the counterfeit, the papacy begins to be regathered. It's going to take them to Panium, or a repeat of 1945. And in this history, it's the story of Pope Francis. Those who upheld the view of John Paul II believe that Pope Francis is virtually the Antichrist. And the Catholic Church, and it's interesting, within the church, you have the Catholics themselves calling their Catholic Pope the Antichrist. Same division, that you see the same division in Adventism, you see the same division in the United States, and you see the same division in the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is right now in a state of civil war, because without us realizing it, their leadership was bypassed. This Pope is going to see about the defeat of the King of the South. He's going to do that and behave in the church in a manner that is strange and new from those in traditional church viewpoint. Again, I wanted to point out, now that we're to this point, that this was April of 2019. I know myself that I didn't catch all that is being said about the King of the South here, and who was going to defeat the King of the South, and who Frances would be. And yet you can see by the things that she taught, she knew this all along. I think about how we've been led, and I go back to that quote or passage that I shared earlier about how we've been mysteriously led by providence. Because to me, I didn't know this a year ago, and yet it was presented a year ago. And I don't know if anybody else can say the same as I'm saying. Maybe some of you got it. I know I didn't. So the Pope is going to see about the defeat of the King of the South. He's going to do that and behave in the church in a manner that is strange and new from those in traditional church viewpoint, and that's the conservative Catholic viewpoint. And more in this movement, we're doing the same thing. But not only is he going to defeat the King of the South, he's also a Jesuit, and he's right on both fronts. If we're to look at his name, Francis, he chose that name because of an old Catholic saint, Saint Francis of Assisi. Francis is known for his poverty and his humility, but that was not his commission. The story of Francis of Assisi is about this man who is worldly, and he's walking down the road, seems to be some type of counterfeit of the story of Paul. And he has this vision, and what is he tasked to do? So he's given a commission, and it's Francis, rebuild my church. And he hears that multiple times on a couple of different occasions. The purpose of Francis of Assisi was not to live a life of poverty, but to restore and rebuild a broken down church. And what Pope Francis has been doing is a work of reconstruction, which is why he is facing such opposition by the church traditionalists. We have the same battle going on internally. When we went to our chart, we had failure, failure, success. We cannot take 1945, 1989, and put them on Pope Francis and think he's going to be half right and half wrong in this history. You can't take the failures and make this a failure. Because Rome did not half defeat Pyrrhus, its success. That's the same when we bring it to our reform line. In our next and last study, there's just a couple of other pieces that we want to connect. That's the end of this study. Are you guys ready?
Ready?
When was the deadly wound on the line of Pyrrhus?
$275.
Yep, you got the date right. Do you remember the waymark, the battle?
Oh, was it Beneventum or? Oh, yay! Yay! Okay.
In Daniel 11:40, the King of the South is defeated in 1989. Where do we line up 1989 when this history repeats?
Rocky.
What'd you
Is
say,
that
Jonathan?
Panium?
Yeah, I think Jonathan said it too, Panium. Yeah, because remember 1989 is the story of the priest for Raphia, but it's the story of the King of the South. Panium is the story of the King of the South, 1989.
Right.
So 1989 becomes Panium, which is the Battle of Beneventum. When is the death? So you have the deadly wound. When is the death?
Of King of the South?
Yeah.
1999. No, 1990.
One.
Yeah. one,
That's
yeah.
in the first history, but what about the history that we're in? When's the
The
death?
Sunday law.
The Sunday law. 1991 becomes the Sunday law. Becomes Sunday law. What did Donald Trump say the history of 1989 was?
The rise of the internet
Mhm.
matches the rise of the United States as the sole superpower, something like that.
Yep. The rise of the internet corresponds with the rise of the USA as the world's only superpower. If 1989 is Panium and 91 is Sunday law, what is happening? King of
Someone
the
is rising up.
What?
Is someone rising up there, or someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, if 1989 is Panium, what's happening then at Panium? 1989, the answer's above.
Deadly wound.
Well, King of the North is rising and King of the South is falling.
Hey, I knew it was the United States, but I wasn't sure. So yeah.
Yeah, because 1989 is the rise of the internet, which corresponds with the rise of the United States as the only superpower. So if 1989 is Panium, what's happening at Panium? The same thing. It's the rise of the United States as the only superpower.
Right.
What were Ptolemy and Seleucus fighting over?
Babylon.
No.
Oh, that was.
Sphere of influence.
Antigonus.
Yeah.
Spheres of influence. Is that what?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I guess I have that. That might be for another answer, but it is Coal Syria. It is spheres of influence. And all the King of the North took was Coal Syria up to the border of Egypt. So they were fighting over Coal Syria, but it was a sphere of influence. I should have held out and made you guys get more specific.
I said coal Syria.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry, I didn't hear it. Then you did get it, okay. So what did the USSR lose in 1989 to 1991, which I might have already given away?
Satellite countries.
Satellite countries, which are called?
Spirits of
Sphere of influence.
Yeah. In Daniel 11:40, we see a deadly wound and a death. What else can we see by compare and contrast?
A resurrection.
We do see when there's a deadly wound and death, there is a resurrection. But what was the other compare and contrast we showed?
captivity.
Captivity.
Captivity. Yeah.
The story of captivity. The papacy went into captivity and it died in captivity. Does the king of the south go into captivity?
No.
Yeah.
No. Why?
Because
doesn't
it's its own
have-
boss.
King of the south is no one's kingdom except their own. If the papacy goes into captivity, who do we compare that to?
God's people.
Huh?
God's people.
God's people, Israel.
So that's interesting. That means King of the South isn't a proxy of anything,
No,
because we're God's proxy, and King of the North, the false one, is Satan's proxy.
King of the south is just someone that's in the way until he gets out of the way, and then these two go head to head, right?
Yeah.
It's the only way I can think of to explain it. So yeah, the king of the north and the king of the south were compared. By compare and contrast, you see a deadly wound and a death, but you can't compare captivity to the king of the south because there's no one to put the king of the south in captivity. So when you read the story of the king of the north going into captivity, you compare that with Israel because Israel did go into captivity. So when Israel comes out of captivity as modern Israel, how many parts did they come out in?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
What do you mean? What do I mean? Israel comes out of captivity. When did they come out of captivity?
When they come out of Babylon?
No, we're looking modern Israel. When does modern Israel come out of captivity? When does Israel come out of captivity?
1798.
1798.
Yeah.
And how many parts did they come out in?
2? Are you talking about like Millerites and then 144,000?
Alpha and Omega.
Mm-hmm. Alpha Omega.
Israel and Babylon have an Alpha and Omega history. What did we learn by compare and contrast of the true and the counterfeit king of the north?
Alpha is the history of failure and Omega's history of success? What do you mean?
I have to tell you that I'm stumped on this one too, so. I do the questions and I sometimes forget too.
There's 2 histories of failure, 1 of success. Yeah.
There you go. Yep. So they each have a captivity. They each have a captivity in between. There's a failure, success, alpha, middle, and then omega. I don't know if that's quite what you said. You weren't pointing out the history in between. And that's
Well, it's because there's 2 parts of failure and 1 of success. So the middle is also a failure. That's the point.
Right. Is that what you said?
I don't remember.
Okay. So what we learned is they come out in 2 parts, an alpha and a omega, but there's a history in between. And that teaches us that there's a failure, success. The alpha and the middle history are failures, and then the omega is success.
Thank you. That's a perfect point because I was wondering about when they would do the 3 histories on that, the failure, and then success. That makes so much sense now when they do that. You know, like when they'll do at the 2 failures of Adventist history, and then they'll do the success. But anyway.
Yeah. The 2 failures, the failure was 1888 when they were attempting to get back in the right place, just like the Catholic Church was attempting to get back on track.
Yeah.
So when did modern Babylon go into captivity?
1798.
No, modern Babylon. That's modern.
Why?
Is the question why or
Why?
when?
Thank you. I goofed up all along. Why? Okay, she forgot her prophetic mission. My bad. Why did she not win? Okay. Now, why did she forget her prophetic mission?
That's the same question, isn't
it? She wanted the Laodicean condition.
Oh yeah.
She wanted the wealth to live in happiness and wealth, and not worry about
So
her.
she goes into captivity because she forgets her prophetic mission. Why did she forget it? Because she's in a Laodicean condition and wants her temporal wealth.
And that's when they're fighting against the Jesuits, right? Because the Pope is fighting against the Jesuits.
Right. Because they were given a choice. Maybe somebody remembers the details on this better. They were given the choice to expel. It was the kings, I believe it was, wasn't it? It was a particular king, wasn't it? To give the Catholic Church the choice between, it was wealth. I'm trying to remember the story about it, or to expel the Jesuits, and they chose.
It was France.
Huh?
Wasn't it France?
I think so.
And they were telling them, you guys have too much power, so you either give up your wealth and keep your Jesuits, or you let go of your Jesuits and you keep your wealth, but you can't do both.
And they chose their wealth. 1798 begins the increase of knowledge for the Millerites. When did the increase of knowledge begin for modern Babylon?
1899.
1899. Who is raised up?
Pacelli.
Pacelli's made a priest, and he begins studying the Code of Canon Law. When does Pacelli complete the Code of Canon Law?
1917.
1917. Why was the Catholic Church leadership afraid of the messages of Fatima?
Because
bypass. Yeah, that's fine.
Any more to that?
And they were losing their influence of the people. The people were out of control, or something like that.
So their fear was, why would Mary send a message to Portugal and these children and not to them? The popes in this history were afraid that they were losing control. Yeah, the control right, just the wrong one. So it's popes, they were afraid that they were losing control. So how did October 22nd, 1844 end?
In disappointment.
In disappointment. Why?
Because they messed up.
Christ didn't come.
They messed up.
They
Yeah.
haven't-
It was a close of probation and not the second advent.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
got the message wrong.
Yeah.
Samuel Snow gave a message that was half right and half wrong. What was he wrong on? And Phil already answered that, where they said that it was going to be the second advent, but it was a close of probation. That's it. And everybody did pretty well.
Thank you.
And
That was good.
our discussion
you.
was perfect because it's 1:29. I was worried that we wouldn't get to the end and we closed right on time.
Wow. Sister Lane, you came up with those questions yourself?
No, they were right out of the notes.
Oh, well, of course, but oh, they were like her original questions, or did you just kind of alter them a little bit?
I what altered. It takes a lot of thought, so I had to race through that part. Probably why I forget some of them as I go through it.
Yeah, that was good.
So I think we're all gaining strength in the message. And my prayer is that we gain strength in the love for others. Because all
Amen.
knowledge isn't going to make a difference if we don't love as Christ loved. And I encourage you guys to take up that challenge too, no matter how much we all have to do. Try to squeeze in some Desire of Ages, a little bit every day. And
Yeah, Elder Parminder suggested listen to it 5 times and read it 5 times.
yeah,
That's what-
we don't have time to do that. but I had been listening to the various books for quite a few years, but to actually sit down and read it, I read it once. And but I tell you what, I'm like, whatever chapter that was, Days of Conflict, I don't remember what number that was. I did the Passover visit, and I just started The Voice in the Wilderness. But there's so much richness in there for us that we probably, most likely, didn't get, whenever we may have read it in the past. Because as you get more light and more understanding, then you go back and you read these things. There's an awful lot of instruction of how Christ maintained in this wicked world. And he was amongst it all. So we all think that it would be easier if we didn't have to live among them. It's in among the world and the worldliness that we can become what he was. He did it. And so there's a lot in there, just in those first few chapters that I've read, to really give us some instruction that, as we get ready to go to get to Panium, and to be like Christ. Because as Elder Parminder put it, it will change you. Does anybody have any other questions, comments, or thoughts before we break for lunch?
Thanks. That was a good study, Sister Elaine.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And those are all posted. I think I've showed you before, but if you go to the Repairs and the Breach website, I didn't get this one done yet, but I'm going to have them all posted. And if I really get enthusiastic, I really want to get the World War II study on there as part of it, and in the slideshows, the way that I've done it, so that anybody can go through those, whether you have your notes or whatever. I have my binder too, and the binder is helpful because this is what's formulating the simplicity of the message to go give to the Levites. God's doing the work that we failed to do. We failed as well in understanding, but yet God is getting them ready. And that's something else that I was reading in early writings, that that there's the people that did not participate in the first and second angels' messages, but the events that are taking place are preparing them to hear the message of the third angel. So they're actually being prepared to hear the message of the third angel. It's a work that God is doing that we didn't do. And there's another place to touch on that chapter. I think it was the third angel's message in early writings. So he's preparing them to hear it. He's preparing us to give it in clarity. So the greater we understand it, the greater clarity we're ready to go give it to the Levites. But if we don't have that love for souls, if we still have self on the throne, there's no room for Christ and self on the throne of our heart. Christ has to rule our heart. We cannot rule our heart. And so we need that aspect of him, that we have that love for others and a death to self in preparation of this great work.
Amen.
So with that, we'll look for somebody to close in prayer. Maybe Sister Lana, would you like to close in prayer and pray for the blessing over the food as well?
Okay, I could do that. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to get together and study together while in such hard times, through all these troubles, that we are still able to preserve, that we still able to have this little piece of heaven. Dear Heavenly Father, please bless the food that we're about to partake, and bless each one of us for the rest of the day, that we may learn and increase knowledge, that we may be able to be prepared for our mission. In Jesus' name we pray and we thank you. Amen.
Amen.